This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Rob Bates, founder and research director of the Centre for Migration Control, on worrying projections that the white British are on course to be a minority in Britain within 40 years, and what can be done about it.
At the moment, if things were to continue, we are heading straight towards the iceberg. We have probably one last chance to actually turn the tide on this. I think the 2029 election will probably be one of the most consequential in this country's history.
No, it's one of the great scams of all time.
Dr. Tilak Doshi, the Daily Sceptic's environment editor, on Trump's war on America's Green Blob, and Ed Miliband's Net Zero fibs.
When you look at the misinformation that he peddles in his zealotry for climate policy, I can name a few that are just so preposterous on the face of it.
And for our premium subscribers, I speak to Dr. Mario Trabucco della Torretta on the reports that George Osborne is set to surrender the Elgin marbles to Greece, and why that would be a colossal mistake.
Cultural heritage is essential in order to explain and motivate national identity. And national identity is the glue that keeps a national community together.
Hello and welcome to The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Now, are the white British set to become a minority in Britain? Are we allowed to think that that would be a bad thing? And if we do, what can we do about it? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Rob Bates, the founder and research director at the Centre for Migration Control. Welcome to The Sceptic, Rob.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to have you here. Okay, so there's this big report that's come out last week from Professor Matt Goodwin of the Centre for Heterodox Social Science, and it's projecting that on current trends, Britain is set to become minority white British in 2023. And so that's where the white British are less than 50% of the population. Now, there have been other studies that have made similar predictions to that in the past. One of them says 2066. And so, one might quibble with the methodology a bit, but ultimately the message very much seems to be that on current trends, this is set to happen. So, well, what is your response to that, Rob? And I mean, this is alarming, isn't it?
It is, and I do think Matt has blown the doors off a little bit with this report. He's clearly ruffled feathers in not just the sort of mainstream media, but those kind of right-wing outlets as well have been a bit concerned by this report. I think what he's actually done is, not to say too straightforward, but it's a pretty plain projection of where we are when you use ONS data. I think where he takes us really isn't something that should come as too much of a surprise. We know that on current trends, the birth rates of those that are foreign-born is rapidly exceeding those of British-born individuals. I think about a third, as it is right now, of births taking place in the UK are of individuals either both parents being foreign-born or of one parent being foreign-born. And we also know, of course, that the impact that migration is having, driving actually 110% of the population growth at the moment is a result of our open border experiment. So I think his projection is one that we should really take into consideration, and we should actually think about where it's going to be taking us as a country. Because, of course, whilst the white Brits will be a minority, the remaining majority of that group won't be one homogenous group. It will be made up of very many different national and cultural backgrounds. It will be your Botswanans, your Nigerians, and your Pakistanis and your Chinese, and these groups that are increasingly being let in as a result of our open border experiment. So we already are starting to see some of the problems that emerge from living in a society that's incredibly fractured and divided along cultural lines. We, of course, see events such as those in Leicester, where we have Hindus and Muslims clashing. We see the almost daily, weekly events in London with people calling for intifada. We saw India and Pakistan conflict as well when tensions started to raise over in that part of the world as well. So where we're heading as a country is something where we wouldn't have a common story. We would be effectively a nation without a heritage. We would be a group of people that are living side by side, but without much shared endeavour of our ancestors. And that really is what makes a country. It's a group of people who have a common ancestry. They have individuals who have forebears that have lived and worked alongside one another for centuries. And I think it's important to get a sort of scale of how much the change of British population really has been unprecedented. Until very recently, a vast majority of the people living in this country had ancestry that could be traced back to the hunter-gatherers of 7,500 years ago. We always hear that we've been a nation of immigrants, but that is frankly ludicrous. You look at the sort of big, so to speak, population entrances that we've seen over the millennia. Most of them are actually relatively small in relation to the existing population. The Normans, for instance, were only about 8,000 people. So this idea that we've always been a nation of immigrants, and this idea that we should actually be embracing it as if it's something that this country has always been built upon, is a very dangerous narrative, and one that has been used for the last 20 years to really keep our doors prized open, despite the majority of the country not wanting them to be opened. So I think what Matt Goodwin has done is hopefully started to focus minds a little bit more. Of course, the backlash that he has got is unfortunate, but I think it was quite brave of him to put these figures out.
Yeah, I mean, lots of important points you make there. And of course, one of them is, we're told this narrative about being a nation of immigrants. That's not really true. But part of that narrative is that people will come here and they'll integrate into the majority culture, or indeed, the stronger word would be that they would assimilate. And that's what we should really be hoping for. But how can they be expected to assimilate into the majority culture if the indigenous population are no longer even a majority in the country? I mean, it's not going to work, is it?
Well, exactly. And a lot of the reason we have the problems that we currently have is that we've become so culturally embarrassed by ourselves, and we've become far too reluctant to actually enforce expectations of behaviour and norms and how we do things. And you mentioned the word integration there, which frankly has been used since the Blairite experiment to effectively require the British population to surrender large parts of their culture and to focus instead on putting their arms around newcomers and not actually putting that much expectation on those newcomers to really make a conscious effort. And this is why we have, for instance, 1 million people in the country that speak little to no English, because we've been far too welcoming, we've been far too tolerant. And there's a need really to bring back a bit of chauvinism and a bit of pride in our values, who we are as a people, our history, and not being prepared to see it drip, drip, drip away as is currently happening. And, we talk about the sort of assimilation that is not happening at the moment. Imagine that writ large. We see it as, at the moment, existing migrant communities are those areas of the country where newly arrived people tend to head towards. And this is a result of, and this is how you end up with situations such as Whitechapel, where you have tube signs in Bengali rather than in English. And, it's actually not fair either on the existing population or those that are coming as well, because they are frankly entering a country where they're thinking, what's going on? What are the expected norms for me? What am I supposed to be doing? So there is a need to be a lot more assertive. I think it's a peculiarly British phenomenon in that we're very shy and self-effacing when it comes to actually saying, no, this is how we do things. So again, it's not just the issue of those that are currently here, it's also those that are coming and arriving and having even less and more of a watered-down version of Britishness to hold up and aspire to head towards.
Indeed. So there's a reticence to draw clear lines about our own culture. And in fact, there's also a reticence to even talk about this and acknowledge that it's an issue. And so we saw that, a big example of that last week with Richard Tice, in fact, who being grilled by this by GB News' Stephen Edgington. Let's just play a clip of that.
That by 2063, Britain will be minority white British. Is that a concern of yours at all?
Yeah, I don't think that's I haven't seen those predictions, and 2063 is a long way off. But
it's a few decades.
Yeah, it's a few decades. Well, it's I'm trying to do the maths quickly in my head, but it's in most people, I'll be long gone, put it like that.
And similarly, I was struck by an interview that Matt Goodwin did presenting his research to the Daily Tea podcast with Camilla Tominey and Gordon Rayner. And to be honest, they didn't seem very fazed by the idea at all. And in particular, Rayner said something like, oh, well, as long as people coming here embrace our values, then what's the problem?
I think from my point of view, I would take the white bit out of it a little bit. I think skin colour is not so much of an important question in this. I've got, we've all got friends who are black, who are British Asian. The idea that they are less British somehow is quite insulting. So I wouldn't want to go down that route.
Why do you get a sense that people are so nervous to talk about this, or really even want to dismiss it as an issue? It seems crazy.
I think, and not to sound dismissive, I think it's people, predominantly public-facing people of a certain generation, people born at a time when this country was actually relatively homogenous. It was, 90% white British, and I think they were kind of brought up in an era where the shadow of the Second World War still loomed large, and the ideas of what it was to be a nation kind of as a result of that became a lot more fluffy. This idea of British values. Well, what does that actually mean? It's an incredibly loose and vague phrase that is effectively a catch-all for everything. It's things such as democracy or enjoying queuing, which by my calculations would basically encompass 3/4 of the globe's population, whilst also excluding millions of Brits that have lived and been before. So I think there was too much comfort and too much reliance on that talk of British values when we started the mass migration phenomenon. That was because those people in the decision-making positions, or those people that would be commenting on this process, were still wedded to kind of a slightly looser interpretation of what a nation was, because, as I said, the shadow of the Second World War made people far too frightened to actually talk in common sense terms as to what a nation actually was. And of course, as a result of that, people have been sort of encompassed into Britishness and under these catch-all phrases, this kind of love of Emma Thompson or finding Paddington Bear quite charming. I mean, that is not the basis on which to build a solid national identity, and it's something that is incredibly loose and could not really play an important part of an individual identity, because that's what national identity should be. It should be one of the most highly rated aspects of a person, how a person sees themselves. But when you start boiling it down into such loose and vague phrases, you end up with conversations such as we saw with Matt and those on the Daily Tea podcast, which was a kind of unpreparedness or almost an ideological framework which couldn't appreciate the points he was trying to make across. So I think that's the problem we have with individuals sort of born at a time when Britain wasn't undergoing these huge demographic changes. I think, fortunately, the sort of younger commentators, the Zoomers, the so-called Zoomers, and some millennials as well, and people such as Matt are starting to recognise that actually that isn't good enough. That is not a recipe for a good foundation for a prosperous society. It's one for acrimony, it's one for division, and it's one for a real tediousness and dullness as well.
And so I think another reason that people are unwilling to talk about this or nervous to do so is that there's a sense that this future is already inevitable. And so if it is inevitable, then you shouldn't criticise it, because then that would put you on the wrong side of something that's definitely going to happen. But Rob, is it so inevitable? Is there definitely nothing that can be done to avoid this?
So in my view, we have really, and not to sound too defeatist, we have probably one last chance to actually turn the tide on this. I think the 2029 election will probably be one of the most consequential in this country's history. If we see a government elected in that election that is not committed to massively not just reducing inward migration, but then also increasing emigration as well, we will see trends where by 2035, 1/4 of the population will be foreign-born, 1/3 of the population will be first or second-generation migrant. If we are fortunate and we do see a right-wing government assume office in 2029, and I know there's a lot of intellectual work going on in the Conservative Party on this, then there are measures that can absolutely be put in place relatively easily as well if they've got a clear majority. It's just a few fiddles with immigration rules that make it far harder, if not impossible, for any newly arrived individual to actually claim that settled status. I think indefinite leave to remain, it's called, is something that has well served its time. It was introduced in 1971, where we actually had, as a country, net negative migration anyway. We didn't have these, close to 1 million people coming into the country every year. And then that hopefully would start to see individuals that have come in on a work visa begin to return to their countries of origin. I think as well, we need to recognise that the way the immigration system, the inward migration system, has been operating has been something that has allowed employers to pass the buck. It's allowed universities, fake universities really, to make an absolute living for themselves. I was going through the universities that were sponsoring individuals the other day, and there were places I'd never even heard of, and some of them were kind of like Fund Studies Limited. Effectively, why is that a university that's in control of our immigration system? So there's a whole raft of measures that can be introduced, and I know a lot of work is going into it in certain quarters, but I think that's also why a lot of people on our side are so concerned or so eager to see what the reform position on that is as well, because we really do only have one last chance on this. We can't afford to have a government assume office in 29 and get this wrong and not really know exactly which levers need to be pulled immediately. So, look, at the moment, if things were to continue, we are heading straight towards the iceberg. 2029, if we can hopefully have a government elected that has a plan, then it's relatively straightforward to sort out. It would involve, of course, a few uncomfortable decisions that people right now might not like to consider, but I think it's something that is eminently within the realms of possibility.
And so that's immigration policy in particular. Are there also aspects of social policy that could be brought to bear on this problem, do you think?
Well, look, I think we need to place a much bigger expectation on those individuals that are already here. I think when it comes to foreign-born individuals, we need to have more tripwires, as it were, for their continuing presence in the UK, whether that's English language requirements, whether that's the propensity with which they jet back home to their country of origin and then come back at a later date. I think we need to say that basically if you've got settled status and you leave for, say, a period of 6 months, then your settled status is revoked. So there's a lot we can do on that front. When it comes to the actual British workforce, we're not being encouraged. A lot of those millions of people that are economically inactive just simply don't have the hand being extended to them that would encourage them to enter the workforce. Let's take the care sector as a key example. That's a sector that has well and truly relied on migration to effectively fill its shortages for far too long, rather than making those investments in British people, rather than doing things such as, it's even simple things. It's not even just pay increases. It's things like making sure there's a break room, making sure there's a kind of espresso machine. These are the kind of things that a study by the King's Trust found would actually vastly improve the attraction of such a profession. So there's a lot that can be done to kind of get people in work. Of course, we need to have a much bigger conversation as well about the about working age benefits and what can be done with there. That's slightly sort of beyond my purview, but I think there is definitely something that can be done to facilitate. I mean, we've got a pool here of millions of people that are not doing anything. The idea that we sort of have to rely forever on millions of people coming in on visas is ridiculous. And then there's also the point that as a nation, I think we've been far too reluctant to embrace the automation and the 21st century. I was having a conversation earlier today of someone that had just come back from China, and they were absolutely blown away by the use of automated machines, of drones, of AI. That's something that as a country we've been far too reluctant to see used in certain sectors. And, there is the very easy ability for those sectors that have claimed to be incredibly reliant on immigration, such as the care sector, to massively embrace these technologies. There was a study done by the Office for National Statistics, I think it was in 2019, which forecast that if we played our cards right, around about 50% of the functions and roles within the care sector could very easily be done by automation, AI, robots, those kind of things. They're waiting to be used. It's kind of, it baffles me that we are kind of turning our back on what is a very clear pathway and what really should be our future. We are amongst one of the worst productivity rates in the G7, and that is because we've allowed our employers for far too long to shirk that investment in capital equipment that we know for a fact would massively boost the productivity. So there are certain deep-seated trends and habits that the British state has allowed to fester in our country and across different sectors. I think it's something that, again, if a government's prepared to pull the right levers, can be sorted. But again, we've got stuck in such a malaise for far too long. It really does require radical action.
So it can be sorted out, but it does require some radicalism. Now, we've criticised Richard Tice for being unwilling to stick his neck out on this, and fair enough, I suppose. But also, one has to acknowledge there are significant social taboos around this issue. And so, there is a concern that reform will end up being labelled racist and all these other things. So how should a party like Reform try and put an issue like this on the agenda without catching too much flack?
So Reform are actually in a bit of a difficult situation. I think probably by their liking, they went far out ahead in the polls, probably a bit too early in this parliamentary cycle, and thus there's a kind of concern that is inevitable on a psychological level that has seeped in about losing it and wanting to start talking in these bold terms that they perhaps would have done if they were slightly behind the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. Look, I think that the way the Overton window has shifted in terms of this conversation in the last 12 months has been unlike anything else I can recall in British politics. I think the way we're now talking quite readily about the mass deportation of every single person that's here illegally, the fact that even the Labour Party are talking about extending that ILR period, there's a real recognition. We've got the Prime Minister as well, let's not forget, talking about an island of strangers. So the conversation has shifted at such a warp speed that I think if I were advising Reform, I would try and put them near the crest of the wave, but I think at the moment they're likely benefiting from the way the conversation is being pushed by the media, by the independent media, by political commentators, and by studies such as that put out by Matt Goodwin. I think that's doing a lot of the groundwork. And there was polling put out last month, which I think really conveyed where the British public actually is at this point. It was 23% of the population want to see migration running at net negative levels, and another 23% want to see it at net zero. So that's nearly half of the country are effectively endorsing the Reform Party's immigration policy, which is really quite an interesting phenomenon when you think about the fact that this was an issue that was not incredibly salient, despite it probably should have been, wasn't incredibly salient in 21 or 2022, yet all of a sudden it is now shot well and truly up the charts and is the number one issue in British politics. So, look, things are moving at such a fast pace. I think it's very encouraging because we just simply don't know how rapid this increase could continue and where the conversation might go in the next couple of years. So I think Reform's strategy of sitting back, although it is incredibly frustrating and it would be sort of make me a lot happier if they started talking a lot more about it. I think a lot of the work is actually being done not by them but by other individuals. Rupert Lowe MP, for instance, is doing a lot of talking about it as well. Matt Goodwin, political commentators, GB News, people such as yourself, podcasts all over the place. So the conversation is moving, and I don't even know if actually the relevancy of politicians talking about it is as much as it perhaps would have been in the early noughties.
And so is that a worthwhile note of caution then to the more radical activists on the right that, you can get as annoyed as you like about Richard Tice not adopting your talking points on mass deportations or the white population, for instance, but that, what you have to remember is that nevertheless the direction of travel is the one that one would want.
Oh no, we have to keep them honest. We have to keep doing what we're doing when it comes to these conversations. I don't think that kind of the Reform Party would have come out and spoken in the terms that they have and promised a plan on mass deportations if it hadn't been as a result of those online commentators, the work of academics and the work of, again, people such as this outlet or other podcasts as well. I think it's an incredibly important ecosystem that is really actually driving the conversation. And again, this is the power of social media. This is perhaps why we had to tolerate such dross from our politicians for so long until the last couple of years, because we've finally unleashed a kind of a conversation and a sphere of thought that was otherwise locked in and disparate and across the country and locked away and unpalatable. But I think it's absolutely incumbent on every single person that cares about this issue to keep every single politician, whether that is Reform or whether that is Conservative politicians as well. Of course, we have a lot of individuals in the Conservative Party who are increasingly talking in tough terms as well. So I think it's their duty, as it were, to keep banging the drum. And it might be frustrating because politicians don't always respond directly then and there. But my God, it is shaping the Overton window very much our direction.
Indeed. Okay, so let's get on to some of the ways that you've been doing that at the Centre for Migration Control then. I know you've been doing some really important research. And, so there's this report you've done recently on the amount of foreign-born people committing crime in Britain, which was a particularly shocking one. Just tell me how you came by those figures and what you found.
Yeah, so I think that's been an issue that a lot of us have felt for a long time, that the massive increase in the foreign national population has led to a disproportionate increase in crime. So it was a very difficult process to actually get this information off the Ministry of Justice. And we tried previous reports by using police data, but we finally managed to break down the Ministry of Justice, and they agreed to provide us data on convictions by nationality, not country of birth, but actually what citizenship an individual currently holds. And I think what I hope the results kind of paint is the recognition in people's minds that not all immigration is the same, and that, of course, we can talk about the fact that foreign nationals as a whole are 71% more likely to be convicted of a sexual offence than the British population, that foreign nationals accounted for up to a quarter of all sexual offences. But I think what's most revealing about the data is the sheer difference between certain types of migration. So if we look at the sexual offences data, the fact that the Swiss conviction rate is 0.77 per 10,000. Compare that to places like Namibia, where it's about 50. So there's a factor of 50 difference there between these different nationalities. And what I kind of hoped that the conversation would start moving towards, and we've seen that in the last couple of weeks with the talk of red lists, is this idea that our immigration system shouldn't be one that is global in its scope. It should be one that is very much carved out on the data, and that we look to bring people into this country from those nations that we know are more likely to be an economic benefit or less likely to commit crime. I mean, study after study after study has shown that non-EEA migration is almost always a net cost. Yet that's now pretty much 100% of our immigration, our inward migration, is from countries outside of Europe, whereas those that come from the continent are more likely to A, make a positive economic contribution, but then B, more importantly, actually, are more likely to return home as well. So I would like to see the conversation move more towards that direction of which countries do we actually want to be bringing people from, because there will always be a need for a couple of, 20 to 60,000 individuals probably coming in a year, I think is maybe a sustainable level. Long-term migration now is. So we need to be more selective in where these people are actually coming from. They should be coming from places such as Luxembourg or the United States, and fewer people coming from Afghanistan or Iraq or Somalia. These are what would seem as pretty intuitive policy decisions, but unfortunately it's something that the Home Office actually abandoned in 2020, a system it had in place where it would, when processing visa applications, sort of put a little flag next to an individual that had come from a country deemed as sort of high risk. That had to be abandoned because of the Equality Act, if you would believe it. So this is the kind of thing that I think we should be looking to move towards as well, if we are, if we're going to have a properly functioning immigration system that actually works for us rather than at the moment which way it works for the rest of the world.
And so in terms of getting the data to make these kinds of sensible choices, this is a question I've also posed to Carl Williams at the Centre for Policy Studies, because it's not always published very transparently by the Home Office or by the Office for National Statistics, is it? And I know a lot of the time you have to do freedom of information requests for this kind of data, and there's no sort of central ONS database you can go to. How frustrating is it that our authorities don't really seem to want to be transparent with the public and with researchers about this data?
Yeah, I mean, I have to give a slight hat tip to Carl. The one-man crusade he's been on this front for several years now has been extraordinary. It is incredibly frustrating, especially when there isn't this published data, and therefore you have to go down the freedom of information request route, and you end up coming up against individuals that frankly don't really care about their job. They're not really too bothered about making sure that information is actually provided to you, and whip out every excuse under the sun, whether it will cost too much, or we don't have that information in a readily transferable format, or we don't know where to find it. So these are the kind of things that actually having to tell people in these departments where they would find that information. So it's something where you have to spend a lot of time before trying to engage in those freedom of information requests, reading up on the databases, trying to understand the databases, speaking to people that used to work there, and trying to work out exactly how you can fiddle it out in a format as well that individuals who don't really care are prepared to give to you. And of course, the bigger problem is that when we first embarked on this mass migration experiment, every sort of organ of the state assumed that it would be such a universal good and would take us to the sunlit uplands that they didn't actually need to collect this data on nationality. So you will see in many instances government departments, the DWP being chief among them, has simply given up actually trying to collect, whether that be the PAYE tax contributions or it would be the amount of benefits paid to an individual of a certain nationality, because they just didn't think they would need to have collected at any point. So look, it's an uphill struggle. I think people have started to recognise that the information that's actually being given by the government probably isn't appropriate, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. And we've, of course, seen conversations the Labour Party have initiated in terms of migrant crime. Their migrant crime tables will be very much piecemeal, but there's still a recognition that, data is now needed for our immigration system.
And so another report I'd like to ask you about is one you've done recently with Rupert Lowe, and that's on that issue we spoke about earlier of mass deportations. Could we do that with all illegal immigrants? Would it be possible? And what would the steps look like to doing that?
Yeah, so we started this with Rupert quite a few months ago. It's more of a blueprint and an outline to sort of make people convinced that it is possible, because it absolutely is possible. But we have to recognise how emaciated and sort of not up to the task our current deportation and immigration enforcement systems are. We currently have a budget of about 600 million for immigration enforcement, which is a fraction of the Home Office's overall budget. When you think about the amount of money that's being spent on incredibly useless stuff or being given to contractors that aren't performing, you realise that there is a massive need to increase that. We only have about 5,000 immigration enforcement officers, which is about the quarter of the size of the staff roster of Durham Council as well. So, and 2,000 deportation facilities as well. So we've never really had put in place the infrastructure needed for the mass deportations that frankly have to take place. I think one of the most startling findings we made during this report with Rupert was that not just including the asylum bill, but in terms of the illegal migrant population as a whole in the UK, we're losing about £10 billion every single year. So the Conservative government, the last Conservative government under Theresa May actually was putting in place some measures that were creating a hostile environment or trying to make it at least a little bit more uncomfortable for illegal migrants. That's sort of right to work checks that employers would have to perform. That's right to rent checks that landlords would have to perform. But these measures didn't go far enough because they would simply require an employer who had been presented with a CV from an illegal migrant to say, sorry, I can't hire you. What we're suggesting in this report is that actually, no, if you're presented with a CV from an illegal migrant, then you have to blooming well report them to the Home Office. There's also mechanisms in place that need to have a massive public awareness campaign put behind them, such as reporting of potential illegal working, and you can incentivize more people to undertake involvement with that through sort of rewards, little token rewards. There's also a need to get back in place data sharing processes that we once had with the NHS, but unfortunately were quashed in 2018 because of left-wing advocacy groups. Taxpayer funded, of course, they always seem to be taxpayer funded. So there's a need to get those measures back in place. But when it comes to deporting or making sure that the 1.2 million people are no longer in this country, we will have to do a lot of enforced returns, and the numbers of enforced returns have actually dropped remarkably over the last 20 years. I think there's a 70% fall or something like that in the number of enforced returns. But we also need to recognise that voluntary returns have always been the larger part of those people that are here illegally from leaving the country. So we need to do a lot more to advertise that to those that are here illegally. We need to do a lot more to actually make living in the UK without permission incredibly difficult. And some of those measures I talked about on right to work and right to rent are part of that, but there's a lot more that needs to be done on that front. And then we also need to recognise which countries illegal migrants are actually coming from. And there's data that the Home Office actually already has, which shows which countries individuals on tourist or study or work visas are more likely to overstay from. So we need to have a frank conversation with ourselves, but then also with those countries as to the visa distributions that we're doing. And then we also need to start putting pressure on those governments as well to try and encourage their diaspora, their illegal diaspora, to return back to their country as well. So there's a whole raft of measures that we've set out. As I say, it is more of a kind of rough framework than a step-by-step blueprint, but it's something that I was kind of, when I first started toying with this idea, wasn't sure how easy it would be, but having seen that the Home Office, for instance, has a database of 500,000 people that it thinks are here without the right to work, you realise that actually a lot of the work is already there, and it's just about joining different databases up. So again, it can be done.
And so finally, obviously this is an issue that's very fraught at times, and there's all this hand-wringing about right-wing populism and things like this. And one country, however, where it's not been fraught has been Denmark. And really the reason for that is, in fact, that they've never had any right-wing populism, really, because they've just had a centre-left government which has dealt with this issue itself in a sort of sensible, pragmatic way, such as by not allowing ethnic ghettos to form and similarly just not having very high levels of immigration in general. Do you think we could ever get to that similarly just sort of sensible, pragmatic approach to this policy and not have to have all this sort of outrage that doing anything about it would be supposedly racist?
I think we will have a much more difficult job to accomplish it than Denmark does. I think in Britain, we do have a peculiar strain of people that just seem to hate their own country. I don't know where it's come from. I don't know what gave birth to it. But unfortunately, this is an illness that we are burdened with as a country. I think it is a case, and not to sound too Trumpian here, but I think it is a case of sometimes you have to just put your fingers in your ears and ignore the cries of execration, because otherwise you would go absolutely doolally trying to appease Emily Maitlis or sort of posit policies in a manner that you think would get you positive coverage on LBC. It is a case of you have to recognise that the British public overwhelmingly are in favour of measures that need to be taken, and you can't allow yourself to be beholden by the political and media class, because that is what happened far too much with the Tory party. We saw them getting completely chewed up by the civil service, by sort of the morning news round, by sort of lawyers and advocacy groups and NGOs, because they were wanting to seem nice and sensible. No, we've gone beyond that now. We've reached the point where, as we were discussing at the start of this podcast, it is borderline sort of existential for the well-being of this country and the stability of this country. So it's something where I don't think we'll be able to do it in such a sort of nice-sounding, fluffy manner as Denmark, and whichever government does come in to try and do it will have absolute howls, but there'll be howls from a tiny minority of people, and to coin a very lazily used phrase, the silent majority will be supporting them as they take these steps.
Indeed. Well, I certainly think so. Rob Bates, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic. Now, you might have thought that with Trump back in the White House calling to drill, baby, drill, that would sound the death knell for net zero ideology the world over. Well, not so, I'm afraid. The green zealots, it seems, are nothing if not persistent. And to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined once again on The Sceptic by Dr. Tilak Doshi, who is the Daily Sceptic's energy editor. Welcome back to The Sceptic, Tilak.
Thank you, Laurie. Great to see you again.
So Trump is at war with Harvard, as well as American academia more broadly. And obviously he sees them as this hotbed of wokery and of DEI ideology and affirmative action. And so you've written about how this might also be quite significant for the climate debate. But before we get into that, just, I guess, give us a bit of a background about this ongoing battle that Trump is fighting here. What is it about, and what is he trying to do to Harvard?
Yes, I think, it's not directly related to climate as such. In fact, the issue and the confrontation between the Trump administration and the universities were brought to a head, I think, in particular over the issues of anti-Semitism in campus. So several universities got a lot of attention and airtime before even Trump assumed office. And the fact that these campuses were hotbeds of anti-Semitism, as well as, for quite some time, the issue, even during his first term, the issue of DEI and in particular race and sex discrimination within the university entrance criteria for students was also an issue. And the third leg of the set of issues that finally led to that very outright confrontation between the Trump administration and several universities was the awareness of unreported funds taken in by universities from foreign countries, in particular China. So again, the Trump administration was concerned about the undue influence these countries can have on higher education in the US. So that was the set of issues that led to the confrontation. Now, between universities, I think there was some contrast in the kind of reaction he got from the university. So Columbia University, the administrators there began to take note of some of the objections of the Trump administration and have a conversation going and potentially implementing some reforms. The case with Harvard was that they doubled down on their intransigence in every aspect of these issues raised by the administration. So, that sort of set the backdrop for me because in my interest in climate change issues, because I've been working in this area for over 20 years as a part of the time as an academic when I worked in research institutes, but even when I worked with the private sector in the oil and gas sector, the role of universities in promoting the climate narrative and, in fact, affecting policy and business environments was very apparent. And Harvard was one.
Just before we get into that, Tilak, just remind us what Trump is doing to apply the thumbscrews to these universities.
He has frozen $3 billion in federal grants. He's also taken away the right of universities to unilaterally choose students and have a say over their visas. So, the government can, in fact, revoke foreign student visas going to these countries, into these universities. So that is a major tool. If they can actually implement that, then these universities will find it difficult to enroll foreign students. Now, a lot of these issues will be fought out in the courts at various levels. We've already heard that Harvard University is suing the government on a number of these issues.
Yeah, so it's inconclusive how this is going to play out in that political fight. But nevertheless, as you say, Harvard is at the center of a network of climate initiatives and think tanks. And so you foresee this having an effect on its ability to push this climate zealot narrative.
Yes, I think more than just a cutback in funds and a tighter leash on universities by government officials, there'll be several other effects going on as well. So, for example, government departments like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy, the Department of Interior, many of these agencies and government departments under the Trump administration will be far less interactive with many of these universities, given that these universities are part of what some people even term as a deep state. If you've seen some of the posts by Mike Benz on X, he investigates the ecosystem of some of these universities and the role they play alongside NGOs, alongside the State Department and intelligence agencies is quite remarkable. So the aspect that I was most interested in my article was that ecosystem of climate change and climate change policy, the role that Harvard in particular played with promoting research and advocacy on climate change policy at the international level. So my first interactions with this was with a Harvard University professor when I was in a think tank in Singapore, and I became fully aware of their very, very established role as actors in the United Nations sort of agencies, specialized agencies related to climate policy, energy policy, climate justice issues, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly going to have a big effect on that agenda, but also from a political standpoint, it's a really interesting question of who rules here, right? Because, of course, the Trump administration is going drill, baby, drill. It's got this strong agenda here. But, of course, on a long-term, more institutional basis, the question is, will he be able to detach the organs of the state from this massive underlying lobbying apparatus that Harvard and others have? Do you think the Trump administration has the stomach for this fight, and can it win?
Well, that's a big question because the universities are only a part of the entire apparatus, as you call it, related to not just climate change, but the whole slew of concepts and ideas that determine higher education as well as policy orientation of the primarily Democratic Party governments. So the Obama government and in particular the Biden government energized this sort of ecosystem that what we in short call the woke takeover of the institutions. And people have written about it and noted the process in which this essentially neo-Marxian ideas, they have taken root in universities in post-war United States, and that has been on a march through the institutions, not just universities, but also through entertainment, cultural institutions, Hollywood, and so on. So going back to the kind of counter revolution that the Trump administration is trying to achieve, we are talking of them taking on various fights across a number of dimensions. He has pretty much taken on almost every power center in the U.S. and globally. President Trump, I mean, in trying to institutionalize an opposed approach to the woke ideology that many of us talk about and write on.
Yeah, I mean, do you have a sense that he's bitten off more than he can chew?
I think that was apparent from even before he took over office. When you saw his campaigns, his election campaigns, his approach to public health, his approach to the Paris Agreement, the United Nations, the first few days in office with his executive orders, quitting not only the Paris Agreement of the United Nations, but also from the World Health Organization. So yes, he's taken a lot on, but I think that was inevitable. I mean, it would have not been possible to have this Trumpian counter revolution if he did not take on the entire battle order, if you like to call it that, because failing in one would make him weaker in every other area that he's trying to achieve his legacy. So I think it really is how would you put it? Without making it too melodramatic, it is a battle over a vision of the future, a fundamentally opposed vision of the future. And therefore, the split between the US and Europe couldn't be more apparent and striking. I mean, when J.D. Vance gave that speech to his European counterparts, that was an epoch-making speech, I would think. Showing the world, in particular their European allies, what the US meant by democracy and the will of the people. So it is a fundamental struggle of our times that we are living through, I would think.
Indeed. Well, let's get onto that then, shall we? Because there is this strange dynamic, isn't there, where a lot of these ideas do come from America, but really Europe is attached to the ideas of the old regime, whereas Trump actually is trying to turn the ship around. And so, I mean, one example of this is Keir Starmer dragging us back into the orbit of the EU, and in particular, its carbon trading scheme. And so, well, it seems like a really baffling decision, frankly. But before we talk about that, we've got our own carbon trading scheme here already, which is already costing us a fair bit. Just give us a sense of how much that is punishing British industry already.
Yes, our UK prices for carbon, I just checked on the numbers. So on June the 6th, it was $50 US dollars 35 cents per ton of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, if you look at the punishment, it sort of imposes on economies that take up carbon pricing. One of the data points that I shared in my article on this issue about Starmer's surrender to the EU in their talks, post-Brexit talks that happened a couple of weeks ago. The idea that by joining the EU's ETS would help exporters in Britain evade or exempt them from following or from having to meet Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism was sold as the reason that UK wanted to join the EU in the emission trading system. But I pointed out the fallacy in this thinking, because here you are justifying an action that helps a segment of UK industry that exports to the EU, while punishing the entire society by adopting a far higher carbon tax. So there are a couple of points that you can make on the kind of punishment that the UK economy has undergone already with its own UK ETS system, which has got lower carbon prices than EU's. Is an FT article based on government data that showed that from 2021 to 2024, energy intensive heavy industry in the UK had reduced by a third. It was at its lowest point in 35 years. So this is with a carbon tax at $50 odd. Now, when we join the EU, immediately we will go up to those levels, maybe slightly lower, EU's levels of over $80, which they are currently trading at per ton of CO2. So the immediate impact will be immediately felt by consumers of electricity, which means you, me, and everyone else here. Our electricity prices will go up, which will, of course, feed into everything else, because energy, being the master resource, feeds into the cost of producing and consuming everything else. So we will be punishing ourselves even further by joining the EU ETS. And it's interesting to note that our prices now are higher than the EU's median price, power prices. So we pay something like 26 pence per kilowatt hour. Germany is something like 18 to 20 pence per kilowatt hour. The US, 7 to 8 pence per kilowatt hour. So, we are already paying the highest electricity prices in the developed world, and Keir Starmer has chosen to make it even worse. The number of sectors that will be affected, apart from the energy intensive industry like cement, steel, iron, chemicals, glass, paper, and so on. Power, as we spoke about, the power generators, and then shipping in the Euro area. These are all major sectors that will be affected. And one more thing that we can look forward to with trepidation, I imagine, is the EU adopting the ETS2 in 2027, which will expand the sectors into buildings and road transport. So that will increase the pain on consumers and on businesses even further in 2027. So we're not even talking about the fisheries and all the other surrender Starmer achievements that were lambasted by many people here. In particular, by Boris Johnson when he cited the UK being a punk player in the EU system without a vote. So it was, as you've seen, there were very few voices that could put a good gloss on any of these things that occurred in the agreement between the EU and UK.
So we're tying ourselves to the EU's own environment policy here. But of course, there's a lot of discontent in Europe about that and how costly it's making things. And as you mentioned, Germany has very high electricity prices as well as us. But across the bloc, I mean, it's not going very well for them, is it?
Absolutely. And that's a very important point, that we are seeing in Europe a tremendous revolt against the depredations of climate policy that has gone over the top under the left socialist governments that have held power in Europe for the last three decades or so. So as you well know, the number of populist and so-called far-right parties that have surged in popularity across European countries, including Germany, France, and a range of other countries. And we see that here as well with the Reform UK party, all revolting against the utter insanity of the net zero mantra that has taken hold of Europe and UK. So in an ironic way, getting closer to Europe might in fact expose the UK more with respect to the kind of reaction that's going on in Europe, led by the populist parties. So like Geert Wilders in Holland, Marine Le Pen in France, the AFD in Germany, and who knows, in a weird way, getting closer to EU might in fact open the eyes of the UK, or at least sections of the UK leadership, and make them more aware of how even within Europe this insanity is being exposed for what it is.
So in terms of our fanaticism about net zero, last time you and I were discussing Ed Miliband and the possibility that he might soon be forced out the door, well, that doesn't seem to have happened. And indeed, it seems Starmer is paying close attention to him if he's signing up to EU climate initiatives. But it's funny, isn't it? Because our elites like to talk about this problem of disinformation all the time. But really, as you've identified in one of your recent articles for us, Ed Miliband is the climate disinformation pusher in chief. And, I know you've been exposing some of that. Just tell us about some of the many falsehoods that Ed Miliband can be found pushing on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, I've written in fact, more than a couple of articles on what people, his critics, call him Mad Ed, for good reason. Now, when you look at the misinformation that he peddles in his zealotry for climate policy, I think I can name a few that are just so preposterous on the face of it. One of it he calls homegrown cheap renewable energy. Now, anyone with even the least amount of understanding of what energy is and what technology to use the energy is, there's nothing homegrown about solar and wind. Not a single solar module or a windmill is actually made in Britain. It's all sourced from China, which uses coal power to produce those commodity, those parts of those technologies in wind and solar. And wind and solar components themselves are products of oil and gas, the composite material, the mining that you need to do to get the rare earths and in order to make those magnets and other components of both this renewable energy. So there's nothing homegrown about it, and there's also nothing cheap about it, because if it was cheap, then the first question anyone would ask would be, why are you giving subsidies? And why do these subsidies never end? In fact, they keep increasing. And so on that cost issue, leads us to our second major item of misinformation that he's been peddling with some of his colleagues like Dale Vince, who is in the renewable energy space, is that argument about delinking natural gas prices with the electricity price and hence bringing down the cost of electricity. And again, nothing is more preposterous than this argument if anyone understood the bare basics of marginal cost pricing and the fact that natural gas, it just accounts for like 40% of the wholesale price of the household price of electricity. So while you can say that natural gas, when it has been volatile, in particular when the Ukraine war started, it did feed into higher electricity prices. But the natural gas price is back to where it was pretty much close to it to prior the invasion and prior the Ukraine war. And when you decompose the components of a typical household bill, then 60% of that household bill is accounted for by all the subsidies that renewable energy benefits from. So everything from keeping backup power running in order to make sure that you got 24/7 electricity when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, to build all those new transmission lines in order to get this solar and wind energy from isolated areas, to paying subsidies for wind and solar for their CFDs. So this range of subsidies, and excellent work has been done by Catherine Porter, for example, and she's not the only one working this, but there's been some excellent work done in trying to unpack the kind of misinformation that has been peddled by the climate zealots like Ed Miliband and Dale Vince. So this has been an active area of research, work by the Global Warming Policy Foundation and people like Catherine Porter, an independent consultant, has put a lie to Ed Miliband's spiel on net zero. I'll include one more. He talks about how depending on natural gas puts us at the mercy of petrostates and dictators. And again, it's so ridiculous on the face of it. Our three major sources of gas imports in Norway, which produces gas from areas in which we are, the UK has jurisdiction by its side, where we can have our own gas that Norway instead is selling to us. It's so ridiculous. And the other major source is the US, LNG from fracked gas, fracked natural gas that we import at great cost when the gas is liquefied and put on ships and sailed over here. And now, the last time I checked, the US is not a petrostate, nor is it unstable kind of source of natural gas. Now, the third one is Qatar, another major source of LNG for the world. Qatar has been about the most prolific producer in the world, one of the largest producers in the world, and you never hear of Qatar reneging on any kind of supplies. They're very stable, a royal family running a very stable country. So again, this Miliband idea of importing from a bunch of unstable authoritarian regimes couldn't be further from the truth. And now I'm sure we can spend a fair bit of time looking at all the stuff that he speaks about, none of which make much sense.
So certainly some big whoppers he's been telling. Okay, but so finally, just on a lighter note, or I suppose in a way not on a lighter note, a Quango is trying to dim the sun. So, well, why are they doing that? Doesn't that just sound on the face of it like a terrible idea? Won't it cost an enormous amount of money? And, what are we playing at here?
Yeah. One couldn't make it up, and I can imagine, going to a pub and just talking about it to friends and bursting out in uproarious laughter. On the one hand, we are plastering the countryside with solar panels, and on the other hand, we're trying to dim the sun to cool the place down. And for me, the weirdness of it all is that I come from a tropical country. I grew up in Singapore. So coming here and then coming up with these ideas of cooling the place down in England is beyond. How does one make this up? Now, this is supposed to be one of our leading research agencies, a brainchild of Dominic Cummings, highly paid researchers that are supposed to be innovating and inventing to bring the UK to the cutting edge of technology and progress. And here we are with an £800 million agency budget for that agency, the ARIA, the Agency for Research and Invention, Research and Invention Agency. And they're going to spend about over 50 million to actually do experiments to see whether they can cool dim the sun by putting molecules in the air of various chemicals. Now, again, this is so ridiculous, and we'll just have to see what they do with these geoengineering ideas. There's very little to be said beyond just the preposterousness of some of these ideas, such that ordinary empirical data from the real world just don't matter anymore. So I don't know whether that's a good place to end this, but this fantasy worldview that I cited the great economist Thomas Sowell, who talked about the anointed, who have a fantasy worldview that cannot be challenged by empirical data and real world considerations. I think he had it exactly right. We are being ruled by this self-anointed leaders that we have.
Well, let's hope we can take the power back from them. Dr. Tilak Doshi, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you, Laurie. See you soon.
Well, are we losing our marbles? That's the question we have to ask today after a report in The Critic that George Osborne, who is now, for whatever reason, the director of the British Museum, is planning to hand the Elgin marbles over to Greece. And to discuss that, I'm very pleased to welcome back to The Sceptic Dr. Mario Trabucco della Torretta, who is a classical archaeologist and historian. Welcome back to The Sceptic, Mario.
Lovely to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, good to have you here. Okay, so this handover, it seems quite outrageous. There's been a lot of alarm about it. But I suppose the question is that right? Is this actually what's going to happen?
So not this time, that's the answer. Basically, it's just a scare. The communication from the critic has been denied by the British Museum just a few hours later than it was published on Friday, and then it was also denied by Number 10. So it's not happening this time, but this doesn't mean that we need to be complacent.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailysceptic.org/donate.